Hi everybody, my name is Donnie Daniels from the Old Patrol. I'm an old and parole inspector from Session 88, and you're listening to the Old Patrol podcast. Ain't no pro like the Old Patrol. Honor first and honor always.
Greetings and welcome to episode 5 of the Old Patrol HQ podcast. I'm your host, Gil Maza. As a Border Patrol agent for over 23 years now, I have always admired and respected our rich, action-packed, and colorful heritage. My journeymen were hardcore, kick-ass alien catchers, and they passed on their knowledge, experience, and all our bad habits onto the next generation. Today we'll be talking with the legendary shadow catcher himself, law enforcement agent officer Hipolito Acosta, retired district director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, who has led an exemplary and amazing career in immigration enforcement, but got his humble beginnings in the United States Border Patrol. He was in Session 109 in Los Fresnos, Texas. You don't want to miss this one. Ain't no patrol like the Old Patrol. Honor first. Greetings to all you Old Patrollers out there and supporters of the Mean Green. Thank you for joining us for episode 5 of the Old Patrol HQ podcast. As you heard in my intro, we have the honor and privilege of having retired District Director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, Hipolito Acosta, as our guest today. He entered on duty in Marfa, Texas on October 14, 1975, and attended the Border Patrol Academy at Los Fresnos, Texas with the 109th session. He graduated 4th in a class of 112 and stayed in Marfa until he reported to Chicago, Illinois as a criminal investigator on October in 1976 after completing his probationary training in Marfa. He worked in Chicago from 1976 to 1982, where we will hear of some epic adventures. In 1982, the agency transferred him from Chicago to El Paso because of a threat against his life and his family. In 1985, he joined the El Paso Sector Anti-Smuggling Unit. In 1987, he transferred to Brownsville, Texas as the first supervisory special agent with the McAllen Sector Anti-Smuggling Unit. In 1989, he transferred to Manila, Philippines, where he became the officer in charge there, but continued with enforcement operations, including, get this, once following a group from Manila to Los Angeles. In 1995, he transferred to Monterrey, Mexico as the officer in charge. In 1996, he transferred to Ciudad Juarez, also as the OIC. In 1999, he transferred to Mexico City as the district director. Finally, in 2002, he transferred to Houston as deputy district director and then retired as district director under the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. Now, he's an accomplished author and speaker with 3 books, and you can Google his interviews on most of the major outlets out there and see his interviews, and they call on him for a lot of information and his views on immigration and variety of things like that. Good morning, sir, and welcome to the Old Patrol HQ podcast.
Good morning, Gil. Thank you.
I'm so glad and honored to have you on our podcast and looking forward to hear about all your adventures and experiences, starting with the Border Patrol and moving on. And that's where I'd like to begin. People could get a lot of your background and information based on your great books. I've read through most of your first book and gotten a lot of background. But tell us a little bit about what led you and what inspired you to join the Border Patrol in the first place.
Excellent. Well, I want to start out by saying my parents and I and my family are originally from West Texas. I grew up in a small town by the name of Redford, Texas, which I affectionately call a suburb of Presidio, Texas. And I've known you. I know you've had at least one other officer from the Old Patrol who was stationed in Presidio.
Yes.
And after I had already come into the patrol, but he gave you a description of some of the things that we went on in Presidio. But that's where I grew up. I went to school there, and one of the things about growing up in Redford, which is right along the Rio Grande River, we had a small presence of Border Patrol agents in Presidio, and although they did not have a lot of community participation in our small town in Redford, we always looked up To them, certainly my family, my brothers and I, my sisters, we had a lot of respect for law enforcement, and we'd see the U.S. Border Patrol when they went through our town or did farm and ranch check, and so there was some interaction, and I looked up to it. Similarly, when I went into the U.S. Navy, I spent 4 years. I joined when I was 17, and 3 of those years were spent in San Diego, where I had occasions to run into the Border Patrol agents, and I would have discussions with them about joining the Border Patrol. And so it was always in my mind. But one of the things that happened, Gil, when I was in the Navy, I enjoyed the Navy, and I had intended to make the Navy a career. Mm-hmm. So when I left the Navy, I went back, and my mom was living in Marfa, Texas, at the time, along with my brothers and sisters. And I started going to school at Sol State University in Alpine, a great little school in West Texas, with the intention of getting my degree and returning active duty as a Navy officer. And during that period of time, I stayed with the U.S. Naval Reserves as I was going to school. Well, one day I went to the post office and I saw a former Border Patrol pilot who was in uniform. He was an assistant chief by the name of Charlie Henderson. Mm-hmm. And we struck up a conversation, and he told me about his flying experience in the military and the Border Patrol. And as we were getting ready to leave, he said, young man, you would make a great Border Patrol agent. Why don't you apply? And I said, that's a fantastic idea. And back then, you could actually apply with a form that they had at the post office. So for the exam. So I took that form and I filled it out and I sent it in. And a few weeks later, I got notified that I had been scheduled for an exam in El Paso. And so this was in early 1975. Mm-hmm. So I went to the exam in El Paso. I didn't know how I had done, but a few months later, I think about 3 months later, I got notification that I had been scheduled for an interview in El Paso itself. So I drove the 165, 170 miles from Marfa to El Paso for my Border Patrol interview. And I will tell you, it was a rather interesting interview because the gentleman, the officer that was heading up the panel, was an individual by the name of Jim Reed, and they used to call him Jungle Jim Reed. He spent an entire career in the Marine Corps and the Marine Corps Reserves. It was quite a legendary guy in those particular areas. But Chief Reed actually was a very hard interviewer, and I never forget. But that's how I started my career. They selected me for the position, and a few months later, I got notification. I think about 4 months later, I got notification that I had been assigned to Marfa Station, Marfa Sector in Marfa, and I was already living in Marfa. I had just got married, and so it was a great start for the career back in 1975.
Okay, and by the way, just as a side note, when you read your book, you get to find out how you met your beautiful wife, Terry, right? And you were living in Marfa. So tell me, what you first got to the station there in Marfa, what was the work like there?
Well, it was quite an experience, to be honest with you, in terms of first reporting in, because let me just share that it turns out that the individual who interviewed me in El Paso on the oral board was none other than Jungle Jim Reed, was the deputy chief. And he had scared the whiz out of me during my interview, and come to find out, he's the one that received us when we got into Marfa. And my new colleagues there, the trainees that reported in with me, were actually 5 outsiders. I think 4 from New York and 1 from somewhere in the East Coast, and myself, a local guy, reported into to the station. Uh-huh. And I have to share this with you. One of the individuals from New York had a little bit of long hair. He wore sandals. A great guy. And when we walked in, sat down, Deputy Chief Reed said, I want gentlemen to know one thing. There's at least one of you who's not going to make it. Mm. And I will share with you that if you do want to make it, I suggest that you go to the barber shop and cut your hair as short or shorter than mine. He was bald. So, but we had a local barber shop that was run by the name of Richie Subiate, who gave haircuts to all the Border Patrol agents back then. So they took us in a patrol vehicle to go get our haircuts with Richie. And you can be assured, my hair was very short by the time I came back to the station.
I can imagine.
So, but the work itself was great. Marfa back then was it was a sector headquarters, but we had Station 1, and I believe, if I remember correctly, and I could be off on a few numbers, I think we only had about 26 agents for Station 1 in Marfa, and that's, I think, Big Bend sector, which it's called now, is probably the largest in terms of size in the Border Patrol. I'm not too sure about that, but I've heard that before. So it kind of gives you an idea that we were pretty thin in what we did. My first duty when I reported to Marfa in February, and it gets pretty cold up there, was worked in the checkpoint south of Alpine from midnight to 8 with Dennis Worrell, a wonderful journeyman agent who was there at the time. So I thought it was interesting. I enjoyed the work. I had enjoyed the academy in Los Fresnos when I reported in. I had a great time, and I will share this with you. I don't think you can do this nowadays, but when I reported into the training academy, about a month later, I rented a small apartment and took my new wife to the academy. She stayed with me until I graduated.
Ah, okay. By the way, this podcast enjoys everything after the words. I don't think you can do this now, but just so you know. So, what did the daily work consist of for you? Because you spent basically a year in Marfa until your probationary training ended, correct?
That's right.
And so, pretty much, what did the rest of the work consist of, and what was your your daily duties, and what was the focus of the station? What was the management like at the time?
Well, it was certainly, the deputy chief, like I said, had been, I think, a Marine colonel, so the discipline that he had going on at the station. We had I know that back then trainees were to be seen and not to be heard. Clean the car, make sure you get everything ready, and be there early. Which, by the way, I was not, and I was forever getting into a little bit of a hassle because I would show up 15 minutes before the shift started, and trainees were expected to report in 1 hour before. So that's a story that they still have around Marfa, by the way. Of course, the way they say it nowadays was that I was an hour late, but it was actually 15 minutes before the station, before the shift. But we had the train check in Valentine, Texas. We had a lot of you call it farm and ranch check, but mostly we have a lot of ranches up in that area, and so we did some of that. And for the checkpoint, we actually had two checkpoints, one south of Marfa and one south of Alpine. Although Alpine had their own station, they were probably about 8 or 10 agents at the time, Border Patrol agents. So it was pretty diversified. We had a good time. We catch a little bit of dope on the road. I don't think it was as bad as it got later on. But we did a lot of tracking, which I found very interesting. It was not a sector where you had a huge amount of interdictions every day, where you have arrests every day. But again, I always thought that our presence was to deter any criminal activity, because deterrent is just as successful as apprehending it when he comes in. That was my thought.
The interesting that you said that about the coming in early and getting prepared, because I've been in agent since 1996, and in the first couple of years of my initial probationary time and things like that, I also, our FTOs, our journeymen also expected us to come in early enough to have the rides ready, to have their weapons already checked out and put in the ride, so that when they walked out of the muster, we just got in the ride and left. So a lot of that didn't change. I mean, nowadays I think that has kind of gone by the wayside. But at least even in 1996, when I came in, that was still something that was very important and part of the culture of the patrol.
Certainly, I think we were certainly very regimented. I have a lot of familiarity of what's going on right now because I've had two sons in the border patrol. One of them is still with the patrol, so I see some of that. I think obviously there's some changes over the years, but those are the days that I recall. It was regimented, and we had I thought we had good discipline. We had a couple. You're always going to find some difficult employees in any particular area or different, but I think for the most part, I found it great working in Marfa. Developed a lot of great friendships. Some that many friendships that remain to this day.
Yes. Now, before we move on to the next segment of your career, was there any good war stories or chisme out of Marfa before we move on?
Oh, I think there's some great war stories. We have some legendary trackers in Marfa, and I've said this story before in the open, so the people involved will remember some of the things that happened. We made it fun. Marfa was not as active as El Paso or whatever, but like I said before, we made it fun. We had good friendships, but I think some of the funny stories are we always playing jokes on each other as well. Because of the great trackers that we had, the trainees again were to be seen and not heard. And one day I came into the station the restaurant up in Valentine, and everybody had already cut the drag. And for those that might not be aware, is that they had already gone through the road, so we checked to see if there's any tracks, and everybody had reported that there was no tracks. Mm-hmm. Well, Ben DeLuca, who retired as an aide chief in Marfa, and I found a couple of tracks over in one of the areas that had been dragged already by one of our tractors. And I said, hey, we got two tracks from this particular area. And the other agent said, no, you don't. And I said, no, I do. So, long story short, you wouldn't believe me. And they wouldn't go out to check it out. I said, well, I'm going to take care of that. So then I went over to the area where he had tracked, and Ben DeLuca and I took out some old shoes from the back of the vehicle that had been left there. I think 4 sets of shoes, and we made tracks on that drag that one of the senior agents had already cut. And then we went up 3 miles, did the same thing, and then we went 3 more miles. So as you all know, you cut the drag and then you go north until you can't find them anymore. So then we came back and said, yeah, we found this track on this area. And they said, no, it didn't happen. So next thing you know, all the units go up there. Sure enough, there's some fresh tracks. And, and I, being the smart aleck that I was, I said, oh, this tracks, I can smell them. They're no more than 2 or 3 hours old. And so the senior, we used to call them seniors at the time, said, well, we're going to put everybody on it. So they go up north, check the first 3 miles, and they find the tracks, and then we jump to the other side. And, of course, after the next 3 miles, you can't find the tracks anymore. So long story short, they said, well, they have to be laid in here somewhere. Well, we couldn't find them. And the senior called the sector to send the airplane. And I said, oh my God, it's getting out of hand. So,
yeah.
So we stay there. And by this time, it's 2 o'clock, it's 3 o'clock, and the senior won't let any of us go home until we find that group of 4. Well, there was no group of 4. The airplane had to go back and refuel. And so I told Ben to look. I said, Ben, I can't do this. I got to be honest with him. I'm going to go tell him that I did it. and Ben said, you can do that, but you're going to get fired. You live here. I'm from New York. I can't afford to go back. So, I don't know if that's a good story to tell, Gil, but I remember that quite a bit. And there were some other ones. One time I responded with Ben DeLuca again to a sensor hit where there was a lot of dope, and we were working by ourselves, and they were instructed by our senior at that time not to respond to that sensor hit because of no backup, and rightfully so. But being foolish trainees and green that we were, we kept telling him on the radio, that we could not understand what he was saying, and I hit a dam with a truck that I was assigned and tore off the transmission on it. So I thought that was going to be the end of my career, but here I am.
Well, that's one of the things that that we like the most in the Old Patrol is talking about our history, heritage, and legacy, but with all the shenanigans that go along the way, right? And there has always been that, hasn't there?
Oh yes, I think every generation has their way of coping, their way of dealing, and certainly making life fun. And I'm sure that while maybe a lot of the tactics have changed, I think that I think our agents probably have as much fun as we did, but maybe in a different way.
Yeah, well, I do notice that Border Patrol agents are willing to do a lot of overtime for the sake of a practical joke on somebody else. You know?
Oh, without a doubt. I think it goes with the territory. It's probably I think if you were to go through each generation, I'm sure you're going to find all kinds of stories. As a matter of fact, I was listening to one of your podcasts on Mr. Daniels, and I had to laugh because I noticed, of course, that his session was the 88th session, and mine was 109, which is something like 31 sessions later, and he had just as much fun talking about the things that they did as I have about talking about the things that we did as I was growing up in the service.
Yes. Now, in reading your book, I got the impression that while you thoroughly enjoyed coming into the patrol, going through all those things, having this fun, working the traffic, that somehow it just wasn't enough. In other words, you were catching the people, and you were catching the aliens, and you were sending them back. A lot of them coming back. You weren't able to prosecute many smugglers to your satisfaction, and so you decided you were going to make a change, right?
Indeed. I think, and thank you for saying that, because my first year of office, I thoroughly enjoyed the work. But I yearned for more action. Certainly the limitations we had there was because of the terrain, the geography, and I always enjoyed the sections of law, and I found it frustrating that I wasn't getting what I thought was more excitement in doing those kind of things, and I thought I had more to contribute. So, but I'll share a story with you that actually really put in perspective. I write in my first book, The Shadow Catcher. I write that there was a group. I was working actually sensors down by Candelaria, which is southwest of Marfa, right north of the border. And I had been overlooking a little store that was out in the country that was there for generations. And I saw that a truck pulled up, and people get out and go into the truck, and I found it very unusual. But having grown in that region, I felt there was something. They were up to something. Actually, I thought it might be dope. But a little while after spotting it, I had run a record check on it, and I saw people running towards it and jumping in the back, in the bed of the truck. So I think I counted like 12. So I had my first smuggling case where I was out there working by myself, where I was not supposed to be working any kind of traffic other than working on sensors, but I couldn't pass it up. And it was on a Saturday, and I was the only one on duty at the time in that particular area. And I called it into sector, and the first thing that came back was we had one of our agents working dispatch, a guy by the name of Gene Henderson, who we used to call The Rock. So Gene calls me up, and he lets me know that the senior had said for me not to follow the load because, again, I was by myself. Well, I couldn't pass it up, and I followed it, and we got close to Marfa, and they spotted me and went off the road, and I had 12 bodies flying all over the place. And, it scared the heck out of me. But then we had a great pilot by the name of Johnny Williams, who still lives in Marfa and still flies after many years privately. So he came out with the airplane, and we ended up finding all 12, and we filed charges on the smuggler. And that was the first case that I had done in Marfa. And although I was counseled about stopping the vehicles, I was exhilarated by having actually prosecuted somebody that was taking advantage of the system, about the human beings coming into the country, and I was it gave me that little push to seek elsewhere. And right about that time, they announced criminal investigator positions throughout the United States, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and I had never given Chicago a thought except one of our other Border Patrol agents had gone up there, and I put in for Chicago. But I also want to say something about that, about the criminal investigator positions. Back then, if you were a Border Patrol agent and you put in for positions as a criminal investigator throughout the United States, the district offices liked that. They loved it because they would get an agent who had already been trained, they had experience on the border, generally spoke very good Spanish, and so they would go more with Border Patrol agents for the criminal investigator positions than local hires, who in many cases had to learn a system completely from the beginning. So it was a great percentage of criminal investigators throughout the country, whether Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Jose, Chicago, had been in the Border Patrol and were selected on the Border Patrol. And I was one of those agents that got selected early in my career for the district office in Chicago.
And you know, the funny thing is that both William Metcalf and Charles Cothman that I interviewed for and Donnie Daniels, I think, as well, they all started out in the patrol, but like you said, ended up getting offers because agencies like criminal investigations were drawing Border Patrol away to work for them.
Oh, without a doubt. And that's not just criminal investigations. Customs was heavily going to the ranks of Border Patrol, especially when they had good locations. DEA, when DEA first was formed, you had a quite a number of agents that went into into that agency. So it was a fertile ground for recruiting good law enforcement officers.
Poachers. They do. They love to take a bunch of our guys with them because the Border Patrol did offer some excellent training then, even to today, right?
Oh yes, without a doubt.
So, sir, so then you ended up putting in for that position and you took it, and so you left to Chicago in '76. Correct?
That's correct. I reported to Chicago exactly 1 year later after having started with the Border Patrol in October of 1976.
Well, then it looks like it didn't take long before you ended up volunteering for a certain operation. Can you tell us about that?
Certainly. I've been in Chicago for about 2 months, November and December, and my functions have been reported to the office, and we did what back then was called area control. That's basically doing operations to go after illegal aliens in factories or wherever. Those type of operations. So I worked that the first 2 months, but then I heard through the grapevine. Let me back up just a little bit. We had some great agents in Chicago that have been with the El Paso Sector Border Patrol, including Gary Rennick, Roland Chase, Brian Perriman, but they were all senior officers when I reported in. You have to remember that I think I was 23 years old at the time. But through the grapevine, I heard that they had a big operation that was headed by Roland Chase, targeting the biggest counterfeiter that they had in Chicago. And I heard a little bit of the stories of what they were doing, but it was kind of kept pretty mum. And so one day I went up to Roland Chase, a very quiet guy, fantastic friend to this day, and I told him, I said, "Hey, I want to go undercover on the case that you're working on Newton Van Drunen." And he just kind of looked at me and he said, "How do you know about that?" And I told him a little bit. Then he says, "Well, I'll get back to you." And I figured I'm a trainee, they're not going to bother. So long story short, in January after I had reported in Chicago, Roland came over to me and he said, "Hey, you still want to work undercover?" And I said, "Awesome." I had never done an undercover case in my life. We had no training back then for working undercover. I had been there for 2 months. But ultimately, I recruited an individual that I had arrested to become an informant by the name of Salvador. And he became a fantastic informant. I needed a place to stay because Newton Drunen, in my view, was the most notorious counterfeiter that ever was encountered by the U.S. Immigration Service.
Mm-hmm.
Van Drunen would have reportedly killed a couple of aliens in Matamoros when he was doing human smuggling. Became a master counterfeiter. Spoke excellent Spanish. But anyway, he was a huge target of both INS and the FBI there in Chicago. And so I got Salvador to allow me to stay with him and 4 other Mexicans that did not know that I was an immigration agent. So I lived with them. We lived in a basement apartment, and I ultimately convinced Newton Van Drunen to allow me to work for him as a distributor, even though Van Drunen already had something like more than 40 distributors throughout the country, and generally would not allow anybody to get close to him.
Mm-hmm.
But, I set up the story, came up with a story, and ultimately, in February of 1976, or 77, we arrested Van Drunen at that little apartment where I was staying with the 5 Mexicans. And, it became legendary in Chicago because they had been after Van Drunen for such a long period of time, and we found his printed presses, we found, thousands of counterfeit documents, and Mr. Van Drunen got a 12-year prison sentence off of those charges. So it's pretty interesting, and I think later on maybe we can talk about Mr. Van Drunen because he certainly did not do those 12 years.
Well, one of the things you told me was that he went to prison for alien smuggling, and that's actually where he learned to become a counterfeiter.
That's where he got his training.
Amazing.
That's correct. When he got convicted the first time around for alien smuggling, I guess he looked for a trade and he found a good one because he was a fantastic counterfeiter for money, documents, credentials. He was just a master counterfeiter. I often say that Newton Van Drunen, if you see the movie Catch Me If You Can, they talk about the counterfeiter. I would say that he had nothing on Newton Van Drunen.
Wow. Now, I got to ask you, what was it like? In other words, you know about this guy. You know he's dangerous, and you're walking into a room play acting to convince this guy that you're legitimately who you say you are and get hired by him to work for him. What was that like? Well,
initially, without having had any training, Bill, you might laugh on this because I showed up in January. It's a snowstorm, and knocked on his door, and they got 2 floors, and he comes down and opens the door and looks at me. And this guy, to me, looked even bigger than what he really was. I mean, this guy weighed like 250, 260 pounds, and he's looking at me down from a couple of steps, and he says in Spanish, "What do you want?" and I looked at him, and I said, "Mr. Van Drunen, I've heard that you're the best counterfeiter in the business, and I'm the best street vendor." And then I realized that is the most stupid thing anybody could say when you come in, because this is not a movie. And I sat there, and he looked at me like, "I don't believe this." Can you imagine showing up at a mafioso's house?
Yeah.
Because that's what he was considered, and saying, "Okay, I would have worked for you," but and somebody that had reportedly killed a couple of people. So he looked at me, and he didn't say anything, and just walked back upstairs but left the door open. So I said, "Well, it's now or never." I only had one person for backup, and he couldn't see where I was at.
Mm-hmm.
So I took it as an invitation. I went upstairs, and all during that time, I'm trying to collect myself, but go in, and he's got a little table, and he's got a Mexican wife, and he looks at me and he says, "I don't know who the heck you are, but you're either a an FBI snitch or something to that effect. You're either an immigration agent or a snitch for immigration or the FBI.
Oh.
And I look at him, and he had said a snitch for immigration, so I was not a snitch for immigration. I was an immigration agent. That's the way I justified it.
Ah.
And I was not working, and I had not been sent by the FBI. So I looked at him, and I said, sir, you know, by my mother, who is still alive, I am neither an immigration snitch, and I was not sent here by the FBI.
So you told the truth.
And it was the truth. I wasn't lying to him. And so he tells me to sit down, and he had a small bottle of whiskey and some coffee, and I saw him pour some whiskey to his coffee, so I did it myself. And it kind of calmed my nerves, but, you know, it's, nowadays we have situations where you have a transmitter, you have social media, you have pictures going out, you have a live stream that you're doing. We didn't have that back then.
Yes.
It was me and you and Van Drunen sitting across the table from each other.
And basically sizing each other out just based on what you were saying and doing right then and there.
That's correct.
Wow.
That's correct. And the thing is, after we left, I stayed there for a good period of time, and after I was getting ready to leave, he said, "I'm not going to commit yourself, but I will check out your story." And one of the things that Roland Chase, my partner, had done, he had gotten one of the HR director at a major company there to put me on their payroll because we knew Van Drunen had some vendors in there. So, believe it or not, he verified that. And then I had told him where I was staying in this apartment with these Mexicans, and I gave him the address. And about a week later, I moved in the following day to the place there. And let me tell you something about my wife. She was 17 years old at the time in Chicago. We had no family up there. We just gotten there. Lived on the ninth floor of an apartment building, and I moved out. We had a young son, and I moved out to stay with these guys while I waited for Mr. Van Drunen. So I think, that was the gist of how we started our undercover career. And I say that because, can you imagine what you went through? And yes, you supported what I did completely. And I ended up going with those guys, and sometimes I would sneak out at 2 o'clock in the morning and go see my wife and my baby, and then and get back to the house.
Ah, wow. So she was a trooper. She supported you and through that all those operations, late hours, days, probably without seeing you, all kinds of things like that.
No, without a doubt. It's been it's been a joint venture, adventure, if you would, and we're blessed by it.
And sir, was there ever a time throughout the entire process until you made the arrest with Van Drunen that you ever thought you had been found out or he had figured you out?
Oh yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. I had forgotten about that part. When I was staying with the 5 Mexicans, obviously it was a small 2-bedroom place that we shared, and I used one of the beds. A couple of the guys did not take a liking to me. One, because there was more individuals inside the house, and they couldn't figure out why I would never go to work. So there was a little bit of a awareness about me. But one day, I had foolishly left my little bag that I had, where I had my badge and I believe my gun, inside the room, and one of the guys went and found it.
Oh.
And this is as we're getting close to making the arrest of Van Drunen. By that time, the tension was heavy because Van Drunen had taken me to his wing. He wanted me to sell more documents, and he would show up unannounced and scare the heck out of these guys. So when one of the Mexicans, by the name of Gustavo, found my badge and my gun, he alerted the other guys. And luckily, Salvador was able to find out that this had happened, and he warned me. And ultimately, I had no choice but to confront all the other guys and tell them that yes, I was an immigration agent, and I needed their help.
And they were willing?
They were either going to go home that day, or they could stay and enjoy an adventure. and become our witnesses. So it took a little bit of convincing. It wasn't it wasn't easy by any stretch, because at the first point, all of them said, "We're ready to go back home. We don't want to participate. We're afraid of this guy, and we don't want to be placed in that position." So, I think and I admire that they said that. I also think back now, and I could have easily been jumped by all four of them, and not make it out of there. But nevertheless, Salvador and I had a strong talk with him. We had our discussions. It was a lot of tension, but ultimately it was fixed up, and I think we ended up drinking a 6-pack of beer afterwards.
Ah, nice. Nothing takes down tensions than a 6-pack of beer, right?
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt. Now, sir, in 1980, a movie called Borderline with Charles Bronson came out, which I consider probably the most ideal representation of the Border Patrol in any movie ever made. There's a lot of other good movies out there, but I thought was the best one. And the tagline on that movie was, "A U.S. Border Patrol officer poses as an illegal alien to catch a killer, smuggling laborers from Mexico." Now, this was a movie plot made in Hollywood. And as far as all of us knew, nobody had ever done that before. But this actually was not fiction for you, was it?
No, it wasn't fiction in that regard. I think, let me just say that before I get into the story, I know that many of our agents along the border, Border Patrol agents, used to go to Mexico, and not necessarily to work undercover, but to have a business relationship with other law enforcement officers. But I think one of the things that I'm not aware of was anybody having gone into Mexico and become part of the group of being an illegal alien. And so when you talk about that story, Borderline, going into Mexico, I had already done that 2 years before, and actually infiltrated a large human smuggling ring out of Juarez, working El Paso and Chicago, and that I'm aware of. That was the first time, and only one of 2 times where an agent is going into Mexico by himself, gets smuggled all the way into Chicago on the border, and not have any backup along the way or anywhere. And I think, I'm proud to say that I'm the agent who has done it twice.
Wow. So tell me, how did this come about? How did this whole idea come about? I hope you enjoyed part one of the 2 episodes dedicated to an interview with Hipolito Acosta. I know I'm absolutely floored at his experiences. Before I close, I'd like to give a shout out to my friend and compadre Gary Brugman of the Gary Brugman Podcast, who has inspired this podcast and walked me through all the craziness involved. Go listen to his show wherever you listen to podcasts, and visit his website at www.garybrugman.com and bounce off some guardrails and prepare to be entertained. Come browse through the Old Patrol HQ store for some amazing products that you can wear proudly, honoring the history, heritage, and legacy of the patrol, with a few shenanigans along the way. Ain't no patrol like the Old Patrol. Honor first, honor always. Now go listen to part 2.